Alright, so it's Boxing Day, and the moon is applying a conjunction to Saturn. So there's a predominant Saturn and Aquarius vibe today, and I thought I'd go with that for this video. But before I really jump into the Saturn and Aquarius stuff, I would like to just sort of explain a little bit of what I'm trying to do, in that I'm not making the most straightforward astrology videos right now. I took a break from it for about 6 months, and I've got a bunch of these different influences. I've been reading a lot of philosophy, taking a bunch of courses, and also just kind of dealing with the whole social, political situation of life after COVID, with all this weird politics stuff going on. And I kind of made this resolution that if I'm going to do this astrology channel, I respect that there's a lot of astrologers. Like, I took a course to get my certification from Adam Ellenboss, and he takes this position of kind of not getting into the political side of it. I respect, those kind of things, but I'm also like, I was kind of making this criticism of like, there's a lot of stuff in the whole world of spiritual media being put online that appeals to these kind of transcendent ideals and transcendent notions, but it's, we have to kind of be critical about the media we consume, and like, even when you're trying to be completely political neutral, we're influenced by so much stuff, basically, right? Because we're in this human, incarnate life, doing our human stuff, that there's all these influences, whether they're political, whether they're astrological, whether... I'm even thinking about talking about stuff like genetics and stuff like this, because there's a whole, like, in science, there's, like, genetic determinism, and the problem that, if you take that too far, you run into these problems like eugenics and stuff like that, where people might want to sterilize people with the wrong genes or something, right? And so there's this kind of, like, there's these territories of, like, these problems and these kind of ethical issues with all this stuff. And even people, I'm also thinking about people who have problems with astrology, who view it as, there's a kind of a joke that astrology is like, almost like a racism, like, oh, you're discriminating against me because I'm this sign or something, right? And there's all this stuff that I want to approach one way or another, but I'm realizing I can't just make a video and do it all in one go, so I'm kind of just bit by bit approaching it, and that's kind of my strategy for making these videos right now. So I'm gonna, without getting too much into all that right now, you'll just have to, so basically you're gonna have to kind of, like, for people that are following along, they can kind of like take things from each video and kind of build it up, and I'm not going to try to do it all in one go in my videos, and kind of have it as the idea of a kind of an ongoing dialogue or kind of conversation that I'm kind of in the process of developing as I go. Anyways, so like to get back to talking about Saturn and Aquarius, though. I basically wanted to start here by talking about an archetype, or it's kind of funny to call it an archetype, because, like, you could say it as it's an archetype as there's a certain motif that shows up in culture, in myths and stories, but it's not, to some extent, it's not even really a motif, because it's like more specific than just being like, let's like, a god stands for a certain thing, like the god of death, or the god of the underworld, or the god of, love or justice or whatever, right? Like, a god stands for a principle, and this is an archetype, and you can have it cross-culturally showing up in different ways, but there's something universal about it and stuff. There's, what I'm talking about specifically is what we call the Wyrd sisters, also known as the Three Fates, and they're most recognized, I would say, as showing up in the motif of the three witches in Macbeth. And if you're into horror movies, there's like Dario Argento, classic Italian horror from the 70s, Suspiria, played off of the theme of a witch's coven, and that they ended up doing a series of sequels of this witch's coven thing, and that there's the idea that there's these secret witch covens, and each one of them was led by one of the three, they're called them, I think they called them the three mothers, but they're the idea of like three matriarchal witches that have these secret witch covens and all this kind of stuff. And it, I mean, this is a horror movie. I'm not suggesting that, like, you know, this is it's that would be what you call literalizing a metaphor if you're going to take it that seriously. But in my astrological training, in learning about Hellenistic astrology, there's some lectures from Robert Schmidt, and I have to admit that I'm not. I've got a certification in Hellenistic astrology, but I'm going to be modest about my claims at, you know, knowing classical Greek, you know, source material and all this kind of stuff. So, but the basic idea here is that of the three fates, each of the three fates plays a different kind of job. They have their own kind of action they play in their kind of witchy dynamic or whatever, right? What I want to talk about today is the necessary, which is, from the Robert Schmidt lectures, he talks about it in terms of Ananke, and then the other two are I don't know if I'm using all the same language that Robert Schmidt would use, but the way I understand it is you've got the Ananke, the necessary, the allotment, which is kind of like divvying out your slice of the pie kind of thing, and the spinner or the weaver, which is kind of like the idea of threads of fate, like the idea of telling stories. Like it's kind of in there with the idea when we talk about yarns, right? Or weaving a tale, and the idea of how a plot is kind of woven together of these different threads that kind of, and that the weaving metaphor is one of them, right? And I don't know about being very specific about making planetary associations with each of them, but when you talk about Ananke or the necessary, there's a very strong Saturn association with Ananke, the specific one of the three fates. And if you contrast Ananke, the necessary, with the allotment, in my view, has a character that is Jupiterian in contrast to the necessary. And the Jupiterian is kind of, because there's a certain attitude of like, it's not necessarily abundance, because if you think about like getting what you're allotted, it's like there's only so much that you're allotted. It's not like you're getting an infinite amount of stuff or something like that. But the allotment is kind of like, this is your lot in life. That if you look at, I was thinking about like trying to use an example of whatever, like celebrities, like even like I was thinking about like people like these, you know, media personalities like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, and even people I may not necessarily like or agree with, but that maybe somebody, you can see that somebody like that has been kind of called to play out a role in society that they have been allotted in a way. That is not, doesn't mean I necessarily agree with it, that I think it's the right thing, the right position to take or whatever, but there's somebody who's risen up to be a big media personality and talk a bunch of shit, and even if it's the wrong position or something, you can say that this person has been allotted this position. They've been they've been given this place to do this thing, and there's a kind of a providence or a divine, like, this is your path in life to take kind of thing. And so when me being an astrologer, all this kind of stuff is very important, because when you're looking at astrology and you're talking about stuff like fate and destiny and reading a chart, it's like you're looking at it in terms of these different principles. First of all, the allotment of, like, this is what has been given you. This has been the chunk of reality that's been sectioned off to be yours. That's kind of like your domain that you belong in. That's you have agency over, and you acting in this domain is just that's like what you're there to do. We've given you this to do, and so that's a kind of the friendly, encouraging Jupiter side of it, saying like, hey, this is for you. Like, it may not be, you may not be omnipotent, you may not be king of the world or something, but this little bit is what's yours, and you can have it, and you can do it, right? But then the other side of it is the necessary, the Ananke is Saturnian in the sense that it's a bit more restrictive, right? It's more about that life comes in and puts kind of like responsibilities and demands and stuff like this on us, right? And there's a kind of there's like what we want to do in life, or there's the idealism and stuff like that, right? I'm going to take a sip of tea and catch my breath before I get into all this. Oh boy. Okay, so like there's a lot of stuff that happens in life just because it's necessary. Like, we have to, how you live your daily life, putting food on the table, feeding yourself, taking care of all the things you have to do, the demands, the pressures, having whatever. It's all like, there's certain things that are just necessary to do, and there's certain like running into restrictions where you're like, you want to do something, but it's necessary for you not to do it, or there's something like, I don't know, maybe I'll, I don't know, what can I say? I'll approach it a bit of a different way. One of the things about the necessity part of it, though, was that to look at it as being just a restrictive thing, like necessity binds you into a certain structure that's necessary, and this is what you have to do, and all this kind of stuff, as a more, paternalistic, you can hear the kind of that paternalistic, authoritarian, like, we just, you like it or not, this is necessary, it's what we gotta do. And that there's the quality I wanted to get with it is the necessary evil, unfortunately, in that there's there's certain things, like, let's talk about stuff like veganism, for example, in that in the principle of reducing cruelty to animals, like making a more sustainable environment, doing all this whatever, right? Like, you can affirm all the reasons why something like vegan politics or that kind of trying to campaign against cruelty to animals is a morally, respectable position to take and stuff like this. But there's obviously going to be some kind of like limitation in that it's necessary to keep the status quo as it is, in some sense, for a number of reasons, which is like, are you going to convince everyone in the world to adopt a certain diet? Probably not. So therefore, it's necessary to accommodate all the people you cannot convert to your cause. It's also, do you have pets and stuff? It's how are you going to feed them? It's necessary to have a certain amount of that kind of stuff to feed your pets. And if you're vegan because you love animals, and then if you have pets, it's necessary to still support an animal product, making pet food and stuff like that to feed your cats. And then so it's like, you kind of run into these kind of problems where you realize, oh, like, I have certain principles that I want for an ideal kind of society, but I start to hit the wall in terms of there's certain necessary things that if I start eliminating these things, there's a limit, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And Saturn often has to do with these limits, and there's certain things, problems about, like, let's say freedom, right? People want to be free. They don't want to have their life dictated by limits put on them that they have no way to get out of. And that's generally why Saturn is one of the more difficult archetypes, and that it's it's associated with your Saturn return. It's associated with maturity, because there's something about like realizing the limit, or realizing that the kind of the necessary evil, or the limit of idealism. I'm also thinking I took a course recently that had one of the recommended movies to watch for this course I took was the Neverending Story. And I remember, it's kind of funny to watch that movie because for one thing, I'm a local of the greater Vancouver, BC area. I grew up in Vancouver, BC. And it was really funny that, like, to see the shots in Gastown in downtown Vancouver, because, like, those, like, so many times I just hung out in that area, and it's just kind of like, it's like just a common backdrop of like where I live, and to see that in such a big movie, and also a lot of the real life kind of, there's something about, I was kind of like of that generation, of that age when that movie came out, and that my growing up being a kid who is kind of imaginative and dreamy, there's like, I can see a lot of myself in this movie, even though it's a really pop culture thing that's pretty, universal, but there's something about the Vancouver part of this filming this movie, and the timing of the millennial generational thing that really is something that feels close to me. But anyways, it's also known for having this really difficult scene in it. And, this is, like, funny, because, like, I have to say, I'm in this position where I'm living with my mom, and I'm about to make this movie about Saturn, and, like, my mom, who's, she's like, just don't make it too negative, right? And I'm like, I'm going to be talking about Saturn. And this is also, like, the dynamic of the Senex figure in my life telling me not to make too negative videos. And I'm like, but I have to be like, the point of this, there's something about the archetype of coming of age that's in this movie, Neverending Story, that includes this really negative part where the horse gets stuck in this big swamp of muck, and it's just, like, the most, like, agonizing scene. But there's something like this where it's like of growing up, and it's like at some point in time, it's like your innocence and your idealism is gonna hit that black swamp, and you're gonna make it through there, but you're gonna, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's part of this thing of the Saturn archetype, is that, like, if you can you make it through that black swamp and still keep your hope and, like, the dreamer, like, like, you may lose a couple horses to that swamp, if you know what I mean, right? But there's something, like, to, like, you're not going to be completely overpowered by that kind of, like, blackness and negativity and all this kind of, like, and I don't want to make it just like a positive negative thing either, if you know what I'm saying, with what that swamp represents. But like, that archetype is there in what I'm trying to talk about anyways. And then I can use that archetype to talk about something else, which is, like, crossing the swamp. You can cross a black swamp like that, right? You could also cross, let's do something more neutral, right? To do something more neutral, crossing a river. And crossing a river is one of these things where it's like, it's not it's not impossible to cross a river, right? Although it may be difficult to cross a river, and you may need to have the right equipment, like whether you're going to be, you could, like, take a boat across the river, or you could build a bridge across the river. There's different things you can do to cross a river, right? But there's something about, like, if you're going to do that, you have to make your boat in such a way that it doesn't sink, or that it's a seaworthy boat. Or if you're going to build a bridge, you need to understand the engineering principles of bridge design, so your bridge doesn't just collapse into the river, right? So there's something about what I'm talking about saying about necessity is that it's not just this black. It could be this part of this process that's like a black swamp that can be really kind of negative and limit your ideas of what's possible in life and stuff like that. But there's another side of it, which is kind of like, you can see that there's obstacles, and it's not that by developing a certain kind of mastery, and this is an archetype that could be used in different ways, but it comes out in our basic scientific community, or if you want to say the community of scientists and academics and educators and, you know, people who go to school and learn. Like, I'm doing all this weird, whatever, astrology stuff, but the point about talking about the Saturn archetype is not to say that there's this magical thing that's like in contrast to the world of science that looks at things in terms of like physics and biology and genetics and engineering and whatever. That there's an archetype in science that looks at the limitations of, or looks at the structure and the limitations of the world, the environment that we're in, and by studying it and understanding it, can basically understand what's necessary to create these bridges, right? To say, which are, it's kind of like the spirit of technology, which is bridging this thing of what is necessary to achieve this thing that wasn't possible, and what and really getting into that process, which my point here is that there's a kind of, the archetypes are not separate from even the most dry, rational, scientific thing. There's like an attitude that doesn't care about being an imaginative dreamer and doing Jungian, you know, working with your archetypes and your inner child and stuff like that. And you're just a scientist and you want to know how to build a bridge in a really literal way. Is that even if you take that in such a concrete way and make it really dry and take out all the hocus pocus magic of it, there's still this basic archetype, which is like you're working with the three fates. The Wyrd sisters. The Wyrd sisters are still there, even if you don't think they are, is what I'm trying to say. And we've created this world, which is a technological society, highly advanced technological society. And I often talk about, you know, if you're using outer planet stuff in modern astrology, there's a certain school that uses modern planet associations that I don't identify with, but they associate Uranus with Aquarius. But the conversation that I have been having about the necessity of, like, if we want to cross this river, what is the necessity that we have to do to make that happen, and understanding the structure and the principles and engineering and stuff like this, is that you could look at that as a Uranus thing, but that's actually there in the Saturn Aquarius archetype without using the outer planets, right? And so there's something about Saturn Aquarius which is not just simply about being limiting, which is not just simply about being, you know, a disciplinarian authority figure, but it's like, if you, instead of rushing into like the freezing cold, like icy river, it's like, you know, we can build a bridge and make a permanent structure, and it'll be really easy to get across this river, or else you can risk your life trying to cross it. You know what I'm trying to say? And so there's something about Saturn which is like, understanding this stuff can like build things which make things what could be dangerous and impossible fairly comfortable, and that's kind of given rise to this technological you know, kind of society that we live in. And the archaic stuff about the Wyrd sisters are in there, but we've gotten so caught up in this way of working with science and technology and rationalistic understanding that we forget that the Wyrd sisters are still in the background, and that, you know, maybe if you're in this, maybe at some point in time in your life they'll show up in your life or whatever, right? Like, and it's not a contrast between the imagination and the technical and the rational, right? But I wanted to say is that like there's a kind of a inventive, mad scientist kind of quality that wants to problem solve and engineer solutions in Aquarius. But the thing is, even that is like can have its downsides, right? And that's because there's the overcoming of problems, and then like there's some, the thing about Saturn Aquarius is that even if you're overcoming the problems, there's a limit. Like the icy river represents a limit, and then overcoming the limit. There's an idea that I've been reading Deleuze, and I'm thinking like there's one idea I got from Deleuze of like the limit displacement, basically. And I think one of the problems with Saturn and Aquarius is that by doing these technological things where it's like, before the limit might have been the geographical boundary of the river, and we've been able, now that we have a bridge over that, we've displaced that limit. And that limit has now been put onto something else, which is not, it may not even directly affect this whole initial problem of river crossing and stuff like that, but the thing is, there might be other systems that are affected, right? Like if you're starting to build infrastructure that starts to destroy different environmental habitats or something like that. And so there's something about Aquarius then becomes about being conscious of how these certain actions play out in terms of a bigger picture, where that just maybe even a transhumanist perspective, where we can see humans as actors within a ecological, community of different forces, that where our interests are not the only, and that if we're creating certain things where, like, if you're talking about like whatever, you know what I'm saying, like endangerment of species, basically endangered species in the non-human animal world, is that the problem with capitalism is that if we do all these technological things to displace a limit, and if, like, just using as easy an example, if that limit has environmental impacts, like, it's not, we've overcome this limit, but we've just pushed that limit onto another life form, another being that limits them in such a way that they could kill off their entire species. And this, I shouldn't have to say this because this is just sort of common sense. Everybody knows that this is a problem with our highly technological, capitalistic kind of society. What I'm doing is I'm bringing now in a kind of environmental politics into the astrology, and sort of showing that in the same way that the archetype is not separate from the whole problem of overcoming, crossing the river and coming up with these technological solutions, is that there's another layer of that starts to open up, right? And where the limit is somewhere else. And what we're dealing with in terms of looking at the future, because what I love about astrology is it deals with the future, and we're in a time where I think we should probably think about what the future is like, right? And that, especially something like Aquarius, is a great kind of a placement and a great kind of energy for having the kind of like problem solving, engineering, understanding the limits and working with them and building solutions. But at some point, what you have to understand is that the limit that is being displaced is always going to be there, right? And that's what I'm talking about, the necessary evil, unfortunately, is that with all this idealism of like whatever, of engineering solutions and fixing, there's only so far you can go with it, right? And there's part of the political problem that I find myself in at this point in time is having to do with stuff like, vaccine politics, COVID politics, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm like by pushing in this direction, if I'm getting into too much trouble, but this is what I feel like I have to do, because I have different points of view with some of my friends with this, because I know a lot of my friends have been pulled into the kind of more what I associate as right-wing conspiracy, blah blah blah. I don't know. Before all this COVID stuff happened, I was involved in kind of some stuff that was kind of like anti-psychiatry activism, and that I think in some way I sympathize with this sort of point of view of being critical with the medical system. And one of the things I also have to say is that I don't think, when it comes to, like, let's talk about like Deleuze and Guattari, if I'm pronouncing, even whatever. The thing about Deleuze is that what Deleuze actually said about things like biomedical psychiatry, and what the position it seems that a lot of Deleuzian followers take, is pretty, like, he wasn't against this whole thing about using medication to treat people, and, like, if anything, Guattari was a lot more I'm if I'm pronouncing his name right, it's Guattari a bit more, right? But Felix Guattari, it was more of the radical anti-psychiatry guy, and Deleuze was more of like a respectable kind of philosopher that was kind of like had this funny influence from Guattari. But there's something about the whole problem about taking positions like anti-psychiatry and stuff like that that if anybody is following me from that scene, you may have noticed that I'm not quite as anti-psychiatry as I used to be, and I've been considering even like maybe making some videos about that and kind of talking about where I'm at with all those kind of topics. Basically, I'm going to talk about that with it because it applies to the Saturn Aquarius archetype. I'm going to talk about those issues right now. And hopefully I'm not getting in too much trouble for approaching these highly charged political things, right? But that's what I'm basically, I've made this resolution that I want to try this and not shy away from it and approach these topics because, I was doing the other thing. I was taking a break and avoiding this stuff for a while. So I've been stewing with this stuff for quite a bit, and I want to try to like put it out there and see what other people think of it and talk about it, and hopefully people understand what I'm trying to do here, right? Basically, I'll put it this way: is that when it comes to the stuff about psychiatry, politics, is that one of the reasons why I'm realizing might not be completely against diagnosis and DSM anymore is that there's obviously a difference between people who have anxiety and depression and people have what in the ballpark of mania, psychosis, schizophrenia. I don't necessarily think that those, like a category that you just use something like schizophrenia or bipolar as like these categories, and people who take it really seriously that say they are like, I'm bipolar 2 or I'm bipolar 2 with borderline personality disorder features and hypomanic blah 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 blah. It's like I don't take it that seriously in the sense that I think by going into that level of technical detail you're really hitting onto some objective thing that you've figured out. I don't really agree with it like that, but I agree with it in the sense that there's that if I'm talking to somebody and I'm just introducing, I'm not telling them everything about what I've got going on, but I've said I've had some mental health challenges, people might often at first say, oh, like anxiety, and it's like, you don't have any fucking clue, dude. Sorry. It's like, oh my god, like, there's something about, like, it's kind of funny because people can have anxiety that's so crippling, but there's something about what goes on in other kinds of conditions that, like, as somebody who's been through life and has felt anxiety and had different problems of maybe being depressed and anxious or whatever that fits into that different times of time, and then talking about what goes on in these other, it's like, you don't have any clue at all. But the problem about that creates a situation where, it creates a situation where us people who've been diagnosed with these other disorders have to deal with a kind of isolation and being kind of like outcasts because there is this part of what are, like, if I'm going to identify myself with this kind of stuff and speak for that. This is what identity politics is, though, right? Is because that is, if I'm going to try to do that, that doesn't really define who I am completely. I'm not like, I don't want to know if I really want to make myself a spokesperson for that, because I'm me as an individual. I'm not just like a diagnosis. I'm not just a condition. That's another thing, right? But so there's certain issues of all that kind of stuff bound up in why I got into anti-psychiatry and stuff like this. There's a basic political issue around medical stuff, though, that if you look up, I found in a psychiatrist's videos on YouTube, and he was talking about different kind of disorders and stuff like that. And to some extent, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't be so against this. Maybe there's something to learn from that kind of systematic perspective, and maybe I should even, I'm considering it as an option. Maybe I should work for the mental health system because I have some degree of experience of dealing with people who have these problems. I consider I consider all this stuff the mainstream academic position that most leftists take, though, to be kind of in there with the status quo of how this system works. And so by positioning myself as a leftist, there's this kind of like tension, because I'm realizing that in most cases when it comes to leftists talking about psychiatry and the medical system, I take this position which puts me in a direction which is kind of more like libertarian right wing, but I really don't like when I start running into libertarian right wing people who have those points of views, I'm like, oh my god, I don't want, like, I have a huge aversion to people who are too libertarian, and so I have this thing where I'm like, I don't want to go, I don't, so there's this thing about kind of like of centering, right? Of where the hell I am at with this stuff anyways. There's a certain leftist thing that's caught up with like people who get involved in going to universities and the structure of what's established with science and how we're supposed to deal with medicine and treating things and stuff like that. And then on the other side, there's sort of like a kind of a new age thing, which is not scientifically accepted, which has become a kind of breeding ground for like kind of like right-wing conspiracy theorists that are all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that could be really easily debunked by the rational minded, you know, scientific people, that there's this kind of breeding ground of all sorts of weirdness of the spiritual, you know, and like there's like there are a lot of there's a podcast that I've listened to a few times called the Conspirituality podcast, where people talk about social media influencers, shady gurus, people trying to like sell supplements on the internet, and like people, you know, pushing these kinds of like crazy right-wing conspiracies and trying to use like spirituality to do that. And I was listening to their podcast because I'm basically in support of a lot of what these guys are saying, but like this is like what I'm trying to say is that I'm fine. Like if I'm going to play out where I'm at with this, I'm realizing that I'm kind of like, to use this idea of being a near enemy to a lot of this stuff. Whereas like there's a lot of like that stuff that what these guys do is that they like. To go back to my Deleuzian perspective here, right, is that if you look at this kind of situation, you've got these guys have developed a certain point of view, a certain perspective that pulls in a certain direction, and then I've also got some other influences that are more spiritual, but I'm kind of sorting it out because there's something in there which I feel is more getting taken over by this funny right-wing conspiracy, like almost. I'm not gonna analyze it too much right now, but you know what I'm saying, right? And there's something about the tendency to make a hard flip either way, to do a hard flip in this direction and say, you know what? Since I had all this problem with the psych system, and I don't believe in the government having control over your body, and I believe in freedom, and I'm going to take a hardline stance against everybody who is in support of, like, you know, a vaccine mandate or XYZ that goes with any medical stuff, and freedom is number one, and so that pushes me into a libertarian right-wing direction, right? Like or else I could say, any of these people that are in that side, that they're associating with groups that are kind of like Nazis. There's this weird crypto-fascist thing, and that people are like, you know, they don't really, their principles of what they stand for and believe in terms of being accepting and inclusive, or like understanding that, you know, maybe there's people with health conditions, and that if you're wearing a mask, it's not just for you, or, you know, like I can't associate with those people, so I have to go with these. I have to give up all my spirituality, because there's the pressure to do a hardline flip, basically, in either direction is what I'm talking about. And what I feel like is that most people just end up like doing that thing. And what I'm trying to do is basically walk the line to understand that there's the different polarities or the different push and pull in different direction, but to see that whatever my position is not that I can still have conversations with people who might be in more aligned with either side of it, but that I don't have to necessarily jump on board with either side of it. I don't necessarily have to antagonize either side of it completely, and I can remain in dialogue with both sides of it, and I can start to sort of, in this position, I can, what's really important to me in my own process has been something which I call separating the wheat from the chaff, which is there's a certain amount of bullshit, to pardon my expression, in all this kind of stuff, and you have to use a process of discernment to, like, what is it that I actually believe is true, and what do I stand for, and how am I navigating my life, and what position, so I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I'm basically, one of the things I wanted to talk about was with this whole stuff about whatever, like there's what I ran into with the leftist politics stuff was, like, if you push that far enough, there is stuff about, like, prison abolition movement, and there's something where it's like I really have a problem with how much of a prison population there is in the United States, how much of that prison population is there for stuff like, marijuana offenses, or like things that are petty things that people shouldn't be spending long times in jail for, probably, or the kind of the whole structure of oppression that puts poor people in places where they have to get sucked into this life of crime and shit, or like, it's a big problem to approach in a video like this. So I sympathize with a lot of the problem. I really, the idea of a for-profit penal system is disgusting to me, basically. But and there's something about it though, where I'm at some point in time, there are people who are really extreme in that. Like, I went to a dinner party with somebody who's an activist in this scene, which is the kind of the abolitionist movement. And that they're basically, in terms of medical, politics, with medical politics, is to, her name is Tina Minkowitz, anyway. So I'm making this reference to Tina Minkowitz as somebody I've known. I don't know if I should do this, but this is somebody, I just think somebody I've sat down and had dinner with and had a conversation with about this kind of stuff. And she's out there doing politics, advocating for a really, like, kind of an extreme position, which is, it's basically saying that there would be no locked wards in the medical system at all. So, but I mean, I don't know about this because it would, like, let's say senile people who have dementia and stuff like that, who are being taken, like, there's a problem that maybe, like, old age care homes, like, have all these problems, and that they're an old age person complaining and being disruptive in an old age care home actually has a legitimate concern with being in a shitty situation. Like, it may not be that they're, and I had this experience last year. I had health problems. I was in the hospital, and most of the people in the hospital were old people, and there were a lot of old people with dementia causing trouble. And the thing is, this is what I'm trying to say, is that I used to take this position that was more sympathetic to this abolitionist thing of not having restrictions on people, not forcing people into isolation, not forcing blah, 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 and trying to work for, but, like, it's like, at some point in time, I had this sense that there's a necessary evil, and using the word evil, like, before I like to shy away from the moralistic thing, and, like, not in, like, a relativism of good and evil, not making evil that, but, like, to say, in terms of, you're talking about, like, of, like, old, like, it's an uncomfortable image, right? But old people, neglected by their families, basically warehoused, having dementia, going senile, all this stuff that we don't, it's like an uncomfortable, this is kind of the leaden, heavy part of Saturn and Aquarius, and that we want to have a liberated society where you can have unlocked wards, and anybody can just wander off into the street, and, like, but it's like, at some point in time, you're like, maybe, like, or there's something there. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that there could be a way to improve the situation. There could very well be ways that we can look at, there's a kind of injustice, there's a kind of way that we can take care of our elderly better, and the Saturn and Aquarius is kind of like looking at the problem there and wanting to try to create a kind of a solution to help it be better. There's a kind of idealistic Aquarius thing, right? But at some point in time, like in working with all this problem, even if you agree with people like Tina Minkowitz and take that political perspective, it's like the reality that we're in is such that, like, even if we set goals of and ideals of what we want to work to achieve in terms of a kind of a emancipatory politics or whatever, is that there's a limit. We're going to run into a limit of how much we can actually do, how much we can actually achieve, how much battles you can win. And it's not a conversation about, like, whether the ideal, it's the principle is a good principle or not, but in terms of, like, what I'm this is the Saturn Aquarius thing, and the Wyrd sisters I'm talking about, is that at some point in time, what actually ends up happening, there's, like, the idealistic theory and the practice and the end result, and what actually ends up happening, and the story that gets woven, and the reality, the world that we have to live with, contends with this force where you run up against the limit, and the limit comes in somewhere, and but politics, in this sense, is a politics of where does that limit fall, where is that limit landing, and who is the one who takes on the suffering of having to carry that limit, basically. And so it's kind of funny because I'm just saying that, like, of exploring that direction, of going in a really progressive, political, emancipatory kind of direction, that I sense there's some kind of limit, and I don't know if I really even agree with, like, I don't know. I'm kind of sorting it out anyways, right? But that was all what I was doing before COVID happened. And COVID is kind of a similar thing, because there's politics about, like, very simply, like, vaccine politics. Regardless of whether they work or not, or how effective they are, the whole thing about mandating a vaccine, which is basically, there's the principle of the Wyrd sisters in politics, which is, the question is, like, is it necessary to get vaccinated? Is it necessary for everyone to get vaccinated? Is it necessary for people who work certain jobs to get vaccinated? Is it necessary for certain people, as clients or customers to get vaccinated? All these kind of things, or to go through different, whatever, restrictions, right? And, like, with the necessity is that what you can argue about the politics about how restrictive things are and how restrictive things aren't, but at some point in time, there is the limit, the necessity for some restriction may be there, regardless of how you understand it or where you want to put that restriction or how you want to deal with it. That basic force, that binding force that makes reality what it is like, it's there that we have to work with one way or another, right? So I've been going on. It's almost an hour video. This is pretty long. I basically want to wrap this up by there's things I've written a bunch of notes, and there's places that I want to go with this, but if I try to get into all the stuff, the kind of things I've sketched out that I want to talk about, it's going to go on really long, and my voice is getting tired from talking, basically. So I'm going to even, like, take a break right now, but before I end it, where I wanted to kind of go with this is talking about anarchism, basically, because I have to say, in some sense, I'm not the kind of person who, like, plays up my anarchist politics. I'm not the kind of person who goes around advertising myself as an anarchist. There's certain friends that I've had that are more into, like, the left-wing anarchist scene, and I kind of have this attitude of, like, thinking, like, these people seem cool to me, but I haven't gotten involved with that stuff to such an extent that I feel like I'm really belong, or I'm part of this kind of like anarchist political left wing punk rock kind of thing going on. But that's that's a much bigger influence on me than anything right wing, basically. Like it's been much bigger influence with me in my life than a lot of this right wing conservative, fuck Trudeau stuff. Like I basically sympathize or kind of see myself as being part of a kind of left wing anarchist kind of movement. And there's one of the things I wanted to talk about that I'm not going to get into in this video because I've talked too much already. But it's such a hot button. There's basic political language has become it's charged, right? There's the thing where you can't, like, the problem of like calling people Nazis or fascists, right? Is that it's become like kind of a faux pas or a fallacy to like hurl insults or hurl highly charged accusations at people. But the thing is, the other part of it, there are actually people that are Nazis and there are actually people that are fascists. But I mean, but like I'm talking about like let's take it for Italy, for example. Like they have a fascist party in Italy, and they have fascist political movements in Europe, and that like I watched a video a while back where there's like a guy who was trying to explain, like he's a history teacher trying to explain fascism, his definition of it. But the way he was doing it, I just felt like it's like I didn't watch the whole video because I was kind of feeling like this is just propaganda properly. This is like a guy who's like trying to apologize for fascism or trying to make, like, maybe I was wrong, right? But what I'm trying to, like, not trying to approach anything like this is it's so highly charged that I feel like when you talk about, like, when you use a word like communism, it's like a highly, highly charged, emotional, kind of like loaded word full of all this sort of like preconceived judgments and like conditioning that comes out of the McCarthy era and the Cold War and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not even saying that I necessarily agree with communism or everything that goes with communism, or that I'd want to identify it as that completely. But, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in talking about any particular position or ideology, but to say that there's these really highly charged things going on, but that maybe there's a way to talk about it that we can avoid all that highly charged stuff, but like actually deal with. You can forget the ideology around it and talk about in a more grounded way what's actually going on, and kind of try to bypass all this conditioning, and that to admit that a lot of the conditioning of how we've been conditioned to think about politics is not. It's like it's a lot of bullshit. Like I think that I have this feeling. To wrap it up, anyways, I have this feeling that the way things are, it's like. I feel like it's a lot simpler than what politics becomes a big jumbled mess because people are trying to like whatever obscure things that are like truths that should be very simple, that hide corruption, hide all the bullshit. It's become this big mess basically, and I don't know if me getting involved in it, like I feel like if I'm gonna do anything, it's such a weird situation we find ourselves in, that like somebody like Kanye West can be like doing this anti-Semitic thing, right? That there's something going, and like the specter of fascism basically, and the problem about doing something like traditional astrology is basically what I wanted to talk about, is that there is something about like the conservative impulse. There's some kind of traditional impulse, conservative impulse that fascism plays off of, and I want to make some videos where I'm approaching all these kinds of topics, but not getting what am I trying to say? I'm going to navigate them in such a way that I'm not just like using these like highly charged like political tensions to manipulate people and all this kind of stuff. I'm just looking, I have this attitude that like I have at least some kind of ethical responsibility in this landscape that's full of people like Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand and Joe Rogan and all these social media influencers, and then it's just like sort of like a lot of stuff going on where I'm just saying, if I'm going to be here in this kind of playing field having a conversation, I'm going to play my position, basically, right? Like I've been reading a bunch of books trying to figure out what the hell how I approached the situation we're all dealing with, and at least now I'm going to start talking about it, start dealing with it. And one of the ideas I'm going to be talking about in the future is, in my next videos, is I'm planning to go in this direction where I'm talking about anarchism, basically. But the thing is, I'm not saying anarchism. I'm not like an overthrow the government kind of guy either. I don't want you to think I'm like one of these, I've got this. There's some way that I've got this idea that anarchism and spirituality and astrology and certain like leftist, post-structuralist, kind of like Deleuzian things, like I've got this kind of thing. There is all kind of coming together for me, and I'm trying to kind of communicate. I'm going to communicate this all together, and I feel the need to do this because I'm pretty sure in terms of people doing astrology content, there's probably not that many people working with it in quite the same way, and I feel like that is kind of like what I'm the position that I'm called to fulfill, like that I'm in this kind of position, and that I have a sense that in some way this is what I'm being asked to do right now, or at least even if I've got the wrong idea, that it's important for me to kind of participate and be in, if it's all like Byung-Chul Han says, psychopolitics. Like if I'm going to be involved in this media environment and having my psyche involved in it, I'm not just going to be a passive. I need to take some of my own shots here. I need to be thrown out some of my own some of my own things into the mix, and not just be a passive subject being manipulated by all this stuff. So I'm here as basically a political actor, and I'm owning that and not trying to assert the fact that I'm just a politically neutral, transcendent guy, which maybe in the past I thought that was what I had to do with an astrology channel, but not right now. So this is my hour-long video now, coming to up to a full hour now, talking about Saturn and Aquarius, as well as whatever, this kind of astro-politics project that I'm trying to do. Hopefully, I don't know, hopefully I'm... I just, part of this too is that like I have to say, whatever, I'm working with what I got here. You have to work with what you got, and this is what I got to work with. So I'm having to go with it. If you've watched this much, thank you very much. And if you want to, whatever. If you want to support me, I'd be very grateful. If you want to give me some likes and subscribes, and it's been a while. It's been a while since I did any natal chart readings, but I have done natal chart readings. And a lot of this is just me working through my frustration of like, how the hell are you supposed to like keep generating the astrology clients to read charts for, or whatever. If anybody wants a chart reading, I'm up for it. Whatever. Like, hit me up. Okay.